get started, what I'm going to do is share my screen that has the calculator, and we're going to walk through this. And then if anybody has a multifamily deal that you'd like to go over, we can put the numbers in here and crunch it out and see what it looks like. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, cool. So this calculator is broken out into 3 sections. The top section is the basic information of the property, like its class, how many beds and baths, it's, the year is built, all that nitty gritty stuff. The next one, which is in brown, that's the income and evaluation section of the calculator. And then the green is the funding and the returns for the investors. So I'll take you through it little by little and show you how it works and what numbers are of primary importance, and why it's broken out this way. So over here on the far left, you see the age of the complex. The reason why the age is important, and we have it broken down into brackets, is because if you have an older property, you're going to have to expect to put more into maintenance and more into CapEx in that property. So CapEx meaning capital expenses, large things like roof, foundation, and all of the infrastructure going into that property. The next one is the units building size. The building size is different than the total unit count, because if you're dealing with a property, each building is, let's say, 8 units per building. That means you share a roof and a foundation with 8 units. And it has its own particular infrastructure within that building for those 8 units. That adjusts as well your maintenance and your CapEx. And then the entire unit count as well adjusts those factors. So these are some of the elements that you need to try to collect when you're looking at a multifamily. How big are the buildings? Of course, how many units are there? And the age of the complex. Over here, we get into the class and the bedroom count. So bedroom count makes a difference in the evaluation. Most people are wanting a 2 or a 3. You want to have a mix. I'm sorry, apartments are typically a 1 or a 2, pardon me. But sometimes you're going to want a studio. People want a different mix, but this will help you evaluate. The formula takes that into account. Neighborhood class, you never want to go above the neighborhood class as far as how you fix up the property. It doesn't make sense to put an A-class property in a C-class neighborhood, because the people that would want that apartment wouldn't want to live in a C-class neighborhood. So you typically want to go up. If you're dealing with an asset that's in a C condition and it has C-class tenants, but you're in a B-class neighborhood, that's a good thing, because you can take that eyesore in the B-class neighborhood and bring it up to par with the neighborhood and make it a better place. And by doing that, you'll improve the property, the NOI, the evaluation. And so this is the actual of where it's at, and this is the pro forma. The pro forma being how it will end up once you fix whatever problems are at the property. And that's something that you want to look at to try to improve the property, because you always want to have some form of an exit strategy. Even if you plan on holding the property, your exit strategy might be to refinance. So if you refinance and you improve from actual to pro forma, you're going to take the evaluation up from its current evaluation to something much higher. So that's something you always want to look at, is how can I improve from actual to pro forma? And you'll see throughout this whole calculator, you have actual in one column and pro forma in another column. So you can take it from its current state to a better state. And then the CapEx, CapEx basically means that it's a formula of the NOI, net operating income, divided by the value of the property. The value of the property is kind of determined by your market. So if you're in a large city and a high-end area, that's a higher evaluation property than if you're in a lower end market or out in the burbs. So the cap rate is kind of determined to a great degree by where that property is located. What's the general going rate for that class of property in that neighborhood? And you'll find that higher end properties in high end neighborhoods have a very low cap rate, whereas a lower end property in a lower end neighborhood has a higher cap rate. The cap rate represents basically what sort of percentage you would make off of that property if you didn't use any finances at all. If it was straight cash, the money you put in, how much cash flow would you get, or how much income would you get out of it in that scenario? That's the cap rate. So the higher cap rate means basically a higher income for that property, but it also means a higher risk. You think about the adage, it's a matter of risk versus return, right? If your return is higher, you can expect the risk to be higher. So that's why a lot of these very low risk properties that are very well maintained, they're totally booked out, 0% vacancy, they have a low cap rate because they're also a low risk. So you'll see A class, a lot of times will be a cap 4, B class cap 6, C class cap 8, and a D class, which is like slumlord properties, would be like a cap 10. So it might sound counterintuitive that your cap 10 should mean a higher return on your money, 10%, but you don't really want to get into those typically because they're very high risk. So just be aware, if it's a cap 10, there's probably hidden things in the numbers that you don't realize. There's a lot of risk in that property and you may not want to take those on. So most investors are looking for A, B, or C. A, they're not getting a great return on their actual cash flow, but they appreciate very well. So if somebody's wanting a high appreciation property where they can lock up their money in a safe spot, they want an A class. And those are usually investors that are very well along in their investment journey. They're not so worried about cash flow. They're worried about maintaining their funds and having high appreciation. And then you get to B class and C class, where they're looking more into the cash flow side of it. And what I like to look for is properties that are currently a C that I can take to a B. And that really improves their value when you do that. And you'll get a big return for your money because of that upgrade that you do to the property. Before we move on, is there any questions that anybody has about this section in red? None. Okay, cool. One thing I forgot to mention right here, I put in yellow the asset class BC. BC means it's in between a B and a C, right? And I put it in yellow because that is a very key element to determining the evaluation. You have to have the gross rents and you have to have the asset class. If you don't have the asset class, I mean, you don't necessarily want to go off of what they tell you anyway. You want to do your own assessment of the asset class, because they will typically tell you that the asset class is a little bit better than it really is. So if they tell you a B, just be aware it might not actually be a B. So you want to look at the property, look at the pictures, look at the neighborhood, and verify if it's really going to be a B class or a C class or where it's standing. So those two together cause the evaluation. We're going to get into evaluation over here in a minute, but just keep in mind, you have to have the asset class and you have to have the gross rent. The CapEx is calculated off of the asset class. You can overwrite this formula, but what it does is it just takes when you put in an asset class, it will pick the cap rate that matches the asset class. And this is just a formula. It doesn't represent all accuracy. So if you're dealing with something in San Diego versus something in Memphis, Tennessee, that's not going to be accurate. So if you really want to get accurate on your cap rate, you need to know your market. If you're working in the Memphis market and you're dealing with a B class property, the realtors around there will be able to tell you the cap rate. What are they trading at? That's what the lingo is. What are they trading at? A 7 cap, a 6 cap, a 6.5 cap? And that's the number you want to plug in here. If you don't know the number, you can just let the formula do its job. When you pick this, it'll pick the cap rate for you. And if any of you have any questions as I'm going along, please feel free to you can either speak up or you can type it in the chat, and I'll try to pay attention to the chat to answer as we go. So the next section we have here is the income section of the calculator. So there's the main most important income that you want to look at are the gross rental income, or GRI. So the GRI means if all of the units were rented, how much money would it be pulling in? So, and if they're rented, this is an annualized number here. So you might get a monthly, but you want to take that monthly for all of the units, multiply it by 12 to get your annualized gross rental income. That's what the GRI is. Very important number. Your evaluation, it really comes off of an NOI, but if you don't have the NOI, if you don't have all the records, which you'll find in a lot of these B and C class properties, the record keeping is not very good. So you might not have all the numbers you need to develop a solid NOI. And if that's the case, you can go off of the GRI, and I'll show you how to do that. So the next thing you want to try to capture is the occupancy rate. They may or may not have the occupancy rate. You want to make sure at least how many units are currently occupied. They might tell you it's 100% occupied, but that doesn't mean that that's the occupancy rate. That means right now at this moment, they're all occupied. But typically a property that is in high demand and the management are doing their job, you're going to use like a 95% occupancy rate. If it's not in as such great of a demand, management's not doing their job so hot, it's going to be 90% or less. It might be 80, it might be 70. If it gets super low, then is when you want to start using caution. Why are they having trouble filling it to 50%? If they can't even fill it to 50, something major is wrong there. And that's when the red flags need to come up in your mind saying, if this property is only filled 50, well, is it because the neighborhood is bad? Is it because the place is a big mess, so bad that it's going to take a lot of money to fix it up? So, it typically won't be 50 just because of bad management, unless they have given it no attention whatsoever. Some investors like that. A lot of investors don't want to touch anything that's super low. So a 70%, 80%, 90%, those are good because you can bring them up to 95 and then add value and add cash flow by bringing it from those numbers up to 95. I'm giving you my viewpoint, but you might ask, other investors, and they might say they love a 50% occupancy because they can get it super cheap. They can fix the problems and then they can bring it to 95. What you're looking at though, when you're dealing with those numbers is if you're dealing with a 50% occupancy, it's not going to be cash flowing. It's almost impossible to cash flow positive at a 50% occupancy rate because of all of the expenses and everything. So if somebody buys a 50% occupancy, that means that they're walking into a negative cash flow situation and they have to fix it as quick as possible to make it cash flow positive. And then the other income, there might be laundromats, there could be, what do you call it, vending machines, other things that will provide income to this property. This is where you put it. So the EGI is effective gross income. The effective gross income basically means you take your gross rental income multiplied by your vacancy rate or occupancy rate, and then you add in any additional income that property makes, and that gets you to your effective gross income. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? All right, cool. So I'm going to move on now to the NOI. The NOI is a number that is extremely important. Without the NOI, you really, it's hard to evaluate the property. You don't know if it's going to cash flow. You don't know how much it's worth. You don't know what you're going to get on a return on investment. But what will happen a lot of times is properties won't have good records, especially if it's a B or a C class. So your NOI is a mystery. You don't have to necessarily walk away from that. I'll show you how to evaluate it if you don't have that number. But keep in mind as well, even if they do have the NOI, they're probably not telling you all the truth. So you can't just trust their NOI. You have to run your own numbers to see what the real NOI of the property is. They're probably leaving out some expenses that make the NOI look better than it actually is. So here are the list of all of the OpEx or operating expenses. There's CapEx, which is capital expenses like roof and foundation and big numbers like that. OpEx are your operating expenses, your day-to-day expenses of running the place. So the operating expenses include utilities that the asset has to pay for, not that the tenants pay for. Any contractor work done at the properties, insurance, payroll, supplies, turnover, and I have included in the same field other. So there could be other things that are involved in keeping that property running that you would include in here. So if you get paperwork from them, you definitely want to include all the expenses from their paperwork in this actual column. Maintenance and repairs and management. All that adds up to the total OpEx right here. So the NOI is basically equal to your EGI minus your OpEx. So effective gross income minus operating expenses equals your NOI. Now, in this case, you see this property was at 71% occupied, and it actually has a negative NOI. It's losing money every month. So that's a case where an evaluation on this, of course, they're not going to hand you the property for free. They're not going to pay you to take the property off of their hand. So you have to evaluate it different in this case where a property is actually negative cash flowing every month. And over here, I'll show you how that works out. But these are all of the different expenses. There could be others that are listed out that you can put in the other column. Just make sure that all of these add up, right? You know, they're all put in here so you're not missing any expenses required for that property. And then on the pro forma side, the pro forma side means what would you expect the property to cost you once you've fixed the property up, you've changed out management, you've maybe even done like you can have the tenants pay for the utilities sometimes. There's different things you can do to address this. The gray ones, again, are a formula, but you can always overwrite the formulas with your own numbers if you need to. Insurance, what we'd expect, and this is simply, this insurance here is based off of a national average of insurance, whereas this is the real insurance over here. So if these two numbers are way off, you might want to adjust this, but you want to keep in mind too that they could be insuring it for a much lower evaluation than what you expect it to evaluate for later. So you would expect insurance to go up from the current insurance level, whereas you might, once you fix the property up and you change your management, your overall OpEx might go down. So in this case, we see that the actual operating expense was $499,000, but the pro forma operating expense dropped to $424,000. So that's how you can evaluate your evaluation is off of the NOI. The NOI subtracts out the OpEx. So if you diminish your OpEx, you will increase your NOI, you will increase your evaluation. So that's one of the things you want to try to do. Decrease your operating expense, increase your income. So over here, you see this pro forma income was higher than the actual income. That's because one of the value adds that you will always want to look for when you're looking at rental properties, multifamilies, is where the rent is under market. So if the rents are 20% under market and you raise them up 20%, you just increased your evaluation of the property 20%. So that's something you always want to look for is, are the rents under market? That's a value add that all investors that are interested in multifamily will want. They will want under market rent to give them the opportunity to bring it up to market. So once you improve the gross rental income, you improve the occupancy rate, you decrease your operating expenses. Now you come to a brand new NOI that is way better than the old NOI. Now, keep in mind too that the evaluation is based off of NOI divided by cap rate. If you increase the property's class, you improve the property overall, you can decrease the cap rate of the property. What that means is if you buy it at a 7 cap and the property is in top shape when you sell it, you might be able to sell it at a 6 cap. That's called compressing the cap rate. By compressing the cap rate, you improve the evaluation of the property. So if you take, like over here, the NOI divided by, we're not going to use this NOI. Over here, this NOI is this 60% rule. The 60% rule means that if you take the gross rental income times 0.6 or 60%, that's what the NOI really ought to be. So if we take this gross rental income times 60%, we get the 422 instead of the negative number. So we could base our evaluation off of that 422. On the pro forma side, this is the 60% rule for the NOI, which is fairly close to our pro forma NOI. This is 739, this is 745. You can see they're in the ballpark. So that 60% rule is pretty good. It gets you close enough to work. So over here on the evaluation side, this is where all the fun stuff starts happening, like how much is this property worth? The list price, they might, typically you'll have some form of a list price, but not always. Or if you're doing off market, you'll ask them. You always want to try to get a number out of them before you disclose your number. So if they tell you, yeah, we'd really like to get 4 million out of it, that's what you would punch in here for the list price. The rehab costs, in some cases, if you're buying it on market, they might tell you what it's going to cost to fix the place up. If not, it's usually best to talk to someone who has a little bit of experience to know with multifamily. You're going to want to look at a lot of different costs when you're dealing with fixing up a property that needs to be fixed up, such as roof, foundation, parking lot, overall landscaping, curb appeal. Those are factors that you include in a big number, like 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, whatever it takes. But on top of that, you're going to have a number per each unit. So if the units are simply outdated, it might be 9K, 10K per unit, something like that. So in this evaluation, it would take $300,000 of CapEx around the whole property for the larger items, and then $9,500 per unit times 116 units. That's what it would take to get the property up to par, which means that your actual expense, your rehab cost, is 1.4 million. So you want to take that into account in your actual evaluation. If it's going to take 1.4 million to get it up to speed, then you need to subtract out that 1.4 million from the property's value. So with the NOI over cap, which this is the way you would typically evaluate a property, NOI divided by the cap rate. This is a negative number. Negative numbers don't work. So you have to have a positive number. That's why we have these other two forms of evaluation, 1% rule, 60% rule. I much prefer the 60% rule over the 1% rule. The 1% rule is not very accurate. One of the downsides of the 1% rule is basically the 1% rule, which has been around for a long time, and it's subject to a very large difference from where your markets are. And so in some areas, it might be a 1.5% rule. In some areas, it might be a 2% rule. But as you can see here, this 1% rule, basically the 1% rule means you take all your gross rental income for 1 month and you multiply it by 100, because 1 month should be 1% of its overall value. And then you subtract out all of the current repairs that need to be done. So in this case, the 1% rule evaluates this place at 4.46 million. Whereas the 60% rule, what the 60% rule does is it takes, as we saw over here, it takes your gross rental income times 0.6 and to get your NOI, and then you divide it by your cap rate. So that's what this is here. Because it includes the NOI in the formula, whereas the 1% does not, it will make your evaluation better than the 1% rule. So this evaluation is 4.6. I would trust the 4.6 more than I would trust the 4.4. Any questions on that? I know that was a lot to go over. Okay. I'm glad that was humorous.
Fire hose.
Was that?
Drinking from a fire hose.
Oh, yeah. Right. Okay. So if it's too much, if anybody needs me to back up, I'm happy to back up. So please just let me know if I need to, okay? So now I'm going to get into the pro forma evaluation. The pro forma evaluation is basically the same, except instead of looking at the actual numbers, we're looking at the pro forma numbers. So we said before that the gross rental income actual right now is 704, but the pro forma is 1.2 mil. So this pro forma evaluation is going off of these numbers instead of these numbers. So NOI divided by cap, the pro forma NOI is 745 divided by the pro forma cap, which is 6%. That gives us a pro forma evaluation of 12.4 million. So you can see a huge difference from the current 4.6 million up to the proposed pro forma of 12.4 million. So an investor that wants to do a project, they're not afraid to sink in 1.4 million into this property. They're looking at a huge return on their investment. And we'll get into the return on the investment in a little bit, but you can see 4.6 million to 12.4 million, you're getting nearly $8 million out of this investment. If you can capture it at the 4.6 million mark. Even if you have to go higher than 4.6, you'll probably still do good on this property. But there's a lot up front that you have to sink into it. So they'll be looking at other things besides just making that money. They're looking at cash on cash. We'll get into the cash on cash, but the more money they have to put in up front, it makes it more challenging to have a good cash on cash return. So keep that in mind when you're looking at a large rehab cost. Cash on cash is very important, and that will play into it. So on the pro forma side, we see the NOI over cap, which is the more accurate way of doing the evaluation. The 1% rule, as you see here, it evaluated at 10.26, whereas the 60% rule evaluated it at 12.3, very close to our NOI over cap evaluation. So you can see the 60% rule is actually very close to the NOI over cap. So that's a good way to evaluate the property. If you don't have all your records solid, just use the 60% rule, or you want a quick back of napkin, use the 60% rule. But the better you can get your records, the better overall. Just keep in mind, they're not necessarily going to tell you the whole truth here. So if you need to do the 60% rule because you don't have all your expenses, the 60% rule will get you in the ballpark. Any questions before we move on to the next section? All righty. So now for the green stuff. So the first thing you got to think about when you get into, okay, this looks like a good opportunity, is how am I going to fund this thing? So funding one could either be some form of creative finance, like seller finance, or traditional lending. Those are the two main ways that you go. It could be, when I say creative finance, there's several ways of doing creative finance. So you might do seller finance, you might do what's called a master lease. It might be a subject to, typically on big properties like this, is going to be either seller finance or master lease. So once you pick the type of financing, here's bank, here's seller finance. Your different formulas over here will change to match your financing type. So you're going to pay more typically nowadays for a bank loan than for seller finance. And the reason is because banks have been raising their interest rates. So if somebody closed it before and people are still used to lower interest rates, then you might be able to, on a seller finance, get away with a lower interest rate. I accidentally overwrote this a minute ago, like 5%. Whereas if you do a bank finance, it's going to be 7%. I'm going to have to fix this. I overwrote that formula, but it should switch back and forth depending on which one of these you choose. So that's important to pick the right one, because your return on investment makes a big difference whether you do a lower interest rate seller finance or a higher interest rate bank. In addition to that, you have the loan amount. So what the percentage of the down payment will vary between bank and seller finance as well. Bank's down payments are typically going to be higher. You're looking at somewhere between 20 and 30% with the bank finance. And right now, with the interest rates where they're at and the markets where it's at, you'll typically be doing a 30% down with a bank finance. Whereas with seller finance, you can do much lower down payment. It might be 5%. Pace, he says that all of his deals are between 0 and 5%. So those deals are totally doable. If you can find something between 0 and 5, that's a much better deal. That means you have less of an entry fee, less money you have to put up front to get into the property, which means a higher cash on cash return. So, it's always good to do seller finance if that option is available. If not, just understand that your percentages are going to be higher for a bank. Your down payment will be higher, and your annual interest rate will be higher. Your term as well, you want to try to have, there's two things involved here. One is the amortization schedule, which is typically going to be a long period, hopefully 30 or more years, and that keeps your payments low. And then there's the balloon. The balloon is how soon do you have to pay it all off? And typically paying it all off means refinancing or selling. That's typically the way that you deal with a balloon scenario, is you either refi it or you sell it, and that'll satisfy the balloon. So the balloon payment, you want to make sure that it's going to be at least 5 years minimum. And that will give you the opportunity to get the cash flow higher, make the evaluation higher, so that you can either refinance it or sell it and get that money out of that current ballooned loan. So this here, the term length, that's the amortization schedule. So if it's a 30-year amortization, that's going to make a big difference in your loan one payment. If it's much less, like let's say it's a 10 or 15-year amortization, then your loan payment will drop considerably. Oh, so I'm going to go back and fix this. It looks like the loan payment is not adjusting with this, and it needs to be adjusting with that. I will give you access to this actual calculator, and this is the template. So as you see, there's a couple of things that didn't work correctly. I will be fixing those tonight. So you can get this calculator. I'll give you the link today, and just know that I will make these adjustments on this calculator so that they're fixed for you, so that they actually adjust like they're supposed to here. You don't have rights to adjust this calculator. You can only do either a download or a make a copy. And I suggest make a copy. It's just a lot easier to deal with and to share. Like if you're trying to evaluate a property and you want somebody, myself or somebody else familiar with multi-properties to help you evaluate it, if you make a copy of this, it'll be online and you can share it with them so they can go through and look at your evaluation and walk through it with you to let you know if there's any holes in your evaluation and what they think of the deal and how you can make the deal even sweeter. So here's the financing side. And then over here, we also have interest only versus amortized. So, that's why the 30 didn't work, because it's on an interest only right now. So if you do an interest only loan, you're only paying for the interest. You're not paying down the principal of that loan. And that's a good way to keep your actual payment lower, which improves your cash on cash return. It improves your cash flow, which also improves the return. If I change this to amortized, now you see this loan payment jumped from 22%, 22,000 to 25,000, and your debt service also jumped. Let me put it back. No, I'll leave it there to amortized. So another thing over here in this green area, you see it has the debt service, which that's an annualized amount that it shows you how much you have to pay on for this property for all of your debt service. So the debt service is your funding one and potentially funding two. Funding one is going to be the main loan, the first position on this property. It's going to be the bank or the seller finance. Funding two, it might be a private money lender, or it might be an LP partner. So GP and LP means general partner and limited partner. So when you're dealing with large properties, they go through a different process. It's called syndication, and where they find the investors, and they have to be qualified investors. You know, PACE is one of the very few people that allows non-accredited investors to invest in the property. It costs PACE a lot of money to be able to do that. But if you can get in on any of PACE's deals, I highly recommend it, because it's something that is not open to most people to be in on a project. Even if you can just devote a few $1,000s to it, that's a good opportunity to learn on his property, and he gives you more information than most people do. So you can see the value of being involved in a syndication project. But there's limited partner, which they're basically just people investing their money into the property. They are the silent money partner that puts the money in and is just looking for a good return on that money. That's why they're called limited, because that's all they do is they put their money in and they get the return. Whereas the general partners, they're the active partners. So they're the asset managers, the ones that are running the project to make sure it gets upgraded properly, the do the onboarding of the project and offboarding. So the general partners are active through the whole process, and they get a piece of the pie for that active activity that they're sharing in the project. Those are your bigger, higher end projects that you'll be looking at with the general partners and the limited partners. Whereas a simple private money lender, they're just looking to lend you some money and get a simple return on that money. So if you go through the route of a private money lender instead of a syndication, then that private money lender might lend you the money just like in a single family home. He might lend you it at 10% or 8% or 6%, but you'll typically expect a higher percentage rate than you would on a bank loan. So private money lender, what's the percent over here? This says I was adjusting this improperly. That's not, this is the percent of the money lender. So that's 10%. If the private money lender lends at 10% and they need, you need another 16,000 for the private money payment, then the overall debt service is going to be a combination of the two payments. So you have this payment here from your first lender and this payment here from your second lender. You add them up, multiply by 12, and you get your entire debt service. So it's important to know the debt service. It's a very valuable number, because the higher the debt service, the riskier the deal can become. If you have bad months and you don't have enough money to cover the debt service, you could be in trouble. You need to make sure you have plenty of room to cover the debt service. So the DSCR, or it's also called DCR, is a very important number. It's important to you or the buyer of this multifamily property, and it's also important to your lenders because it represents a risk factor. If you want a low risk property, it could be a debt service of 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, or even 2.0 is a very low risk. But if you get down to 1, that means you have no cushion, no room. It's all of your debt, all of your income goes straight into the debt, and there's no income left over. There's no cash flow. That's where the DSCR comes into play. So you want to make sure you have a minimum of 1.2, or you can't even get approved for loans. But I strongly recommend not even doing a 1.2. It's just too risky. You want to do a 1.25, 1.3, or even better, The higher the DSCR, the better the deal. Now, let me look at some, oh yeah, you bet. Yeah, any questions so far before I move on? And again, this is, drinking through a fire hose, so please don't feel bad about asking any questions that you have. I'm happy to go over them. Everyone understand the DSCR, debt service coverage ratio? So that ratio should be 1.25 or better. And I recommend even better. 1.48 is basically 1.5. That's a strong debt service coverage ratio. Okay, so now moving on to the next, the entry fee. The entry fee represents all of the costs that you have to come to the table with to close on this property. Let me see here. Before I get deep into the entry fee, let me answer this question here. You have a couple of questions, it looks like. Do you have a sheet with all the formulas on it? No, I don't, Carrie. There's a lot of formulas. When you get this sheet, you can simply click on a cell and you can see the formula behind it and you can see how it's put together. I don't have a sheet that outlines all the formulas. There's a lot of different formulas. Like when you get into the maintenance and repairs on this property, you see this 110 over here. That is in the background. There's a deeper formula on another calculator tab that calculates out what, based off of the age of the complex, the condition, the tenant class, the bedroom count, the units, and the building size, the market value, all those things add up to the 110. And that's basically, that's from Brandon. What's Brandon's last name with Bigger Pockets? The big beard guy. Anyway, he's got some really good books on this stuff. And this is built off of his calculations. It's a lot, all of this develops into the formula for the maintenance and repairs value, as well as for the CapEx value. So I don't have everything all outlined, but it's all in here. So when you make a copy of this, and let me just go ahead and share with you right now, 1 second. I'm gonna put into the chat the link. So there is the link to this, and you guys can feel free to make your copy and use it, check the formulas out. I'm happy to help out. Okay, so Natalie, is this calculator something you share, or do we give you numbers for potential? Yeah, okay, yeah, we just answered that. And Natalie, if you want to do deals together, you want me to review your deals, I'm happy to help you out with that. This is, I'm sharing the calculator with anybody and everybody. A lot of hard work went into this, but I am totally happy to help out, and I'm looking for people that actually want to do deals together, and multifamily is an awesome space to be in. So Turner, Brandon Turner, thank you. Brandon G. It's not Brandon G. Turner, is it? Sorry, that's a bad dad joke. My kids say I have bad dad jokes. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next section, the entry fee section. So the entry fee is a sum of all of the different elements that go into this property. What is the down payment? So this is the down payment percent over here, and that's based off of whether you choose bank or seller finance. See, if you switch to seller finance, it switched to 5%, versus if you did bank finance, it's showing it at 30%. You can overwrite this formula if you want to. Every time you do a fresh one, I suggest coming back to the template and doing a fresh sheet off of that template, because I'm going to be maintaining this. If there's any improvements made, it'll be on this template. So you can always come back and get the fresh template. And if you need to overwrite a formula, like in this case, let's say that you negotiate a 7%. It's a seller finance. And instead of 5%, you negotiate a 7%. So you overwrite that. Now, if you want to make another copy of this, you don't want to use your copy that you tweaked because the 7% formula, the formula there is now wiped out. So just go back to the template every time. Overwrite formulas when you need to. Go back to the main template to get all the formulas back to square one. So here's the down payment. Then you have anything in arrears. So anything that they're behind on for taxes, for their loan payments, this is where you put all the arrears money. Acquisition fees. So your acquisition fees are, it could be realtor fees, or it could also be wholesale fees. So that's where you put anything in here. This is set to a current 2%. So a 2% wholesale fee is kind of typical for a multifamily, but it could be all over the board. So a small multifamily property, you might see a higher than 2% fee. So, you know, it's not, even though it's a formula that's set at 2%, if you just adjust this for whatever fee, acquisition fee needs to be there. Closing cost, again, that's a formula. It's at 3% currently, 3% closing cost for the buyer. Holding cost. So when you're dealing with a bank finance, a lot of times the banks will require 6 months of holding because they want some security that you're not going to have a problem paying your bills. So if your payment, your bank payment is $25,000, then or you have two different payments in this case, your holding fee has to represent all of the money you need to make your payments for 6 months. That gives you a surety that if you have a bad couple of months, you're not going to default on your payment. So this is kept in an account, it's secured there. That's your war chest to make sure you're not going to have problems. And then your marketing costs, what you need to fill the voids once you, like, in this case, it's 71% full, you want to fill it to 95. What's it going to cost to market this to get the place filled up? So this entry fee is a total of all of these fees down here, plus your rehab cost over here of 1.4 million. But it does adjust this 1.4 million based off of whether you're doing seller finance or whether you're doing bank. And the reason is because if you're doing a bank finance, a lot of times you can get the bank to finance 70% of both your purchase price and your rehab costs. So a lot of that 1.4 million can get absorbed into your bank loan. So that's a plus side of the bank loan versus the seller finance. So you see with a bank loan, it says entrance fee is 2 million. Seller finance entrance fee, it's almost the same. It's a trade-off because of the financing of the rehab cost versus the 5% for seller finance and the 30% for a bank loan. But the overall entry fee takes all of these numbers into account to say, this is the number we've got to come up with to make this deal work. I got to come up with $2 million somehow to make this deal happen. Yeah. Okay, so Carrie Neal, I wasn't able to take notes earlier. Can you do a summary of which numbers to calculate first in sequence? So Carrie, it will take an hour to go back through this, but just to help you out a little bit, you start at the top and you work your way down. The two yellow ones are the two most important numbers that you want to make sure for your evaluations: your gross rental income and your asset class. NOI is extremely important. However, it's almost always inaccurate. So don't count on the numbers they give you. The 60% rule can give you a good NOI number that you can go off of if you don't have accurate numbers. And that also gives you an NOI, an evaluation of the property. Your pro forma is what you expect it to perform at after you improve it, whereas your actual is where it's performing now, typically, the evaluation for now. So, you want to make sure to fill out all of these, the age, the units per building, the total unit count, the bedroom count, neighborhood class. You always want to try to improve it. The cap rate is calculated off of the asset class, but you can override it with the real cap rate. And that way you can come up with the evaluation and the pro forma evaluation. Then you get into the funding, where you can determine if it's going to be a bank or a creative. Creative meaning either seller finance, or typically it's going to be a master lease. I just have it bundled under seller finance at this point in time. Maybe later I'll improve on it and have a master lease option as well. Amortized versus interest only. So that develops your debt servicing. Your debt servicing here represents funding 1 and funding 2. If funding 2 is a PML, that will be a debt service. If it's a limited partner, it will not be a debt service. So your DCR is going to be all of the debt services combined. It's a ratio of the NOI divided by your debt service. So this project, after it's completed, should have an NOI of 745,000 divided by your debt service, or the other way around, I'm sorry. That gives you a 2.47 DSCR. That means this is a non-risky deal. Anything above 1.25, you're good to go. The higher this number, the better, the less risk. And then your entry fee, all the different expenses going into this, so that you come out of the, in the end with, I got to come up with the $2 million bucks. So I hope that's a good enough catch up for now, but there will be a replay, so you can always go back and get the details on that replay. So now you need to get into the next important number, which is the cash flow. So any property has to be cash flowing for it to be of any value at all. Some people don't care so much about cash flow. They're more concerned about your the whole project, kind of like a fix and flip. A fix and flip doesn't care about cash flow. It cares about the money coming out of it when you flip it. So the IRR is kind of like the fix and flip number. We'll get into that in a minute. But the cash flow, when you're dealing with apartments, they're almost always want to know cash flow. Very important number. So the cash flow basically is you take your NOI, net operating income, but you have to subtract out a few more things to get to cash flow. Cash flow the NOI does not include the taxes. NOI does not include the debt servicing, and it does. So there's basically, and the CapEx. So the CapEx, taxes, and debt service. So those are the three things that are not included in the NOI. So once you subtract out those three items, then you get to the actual cash flow. So we're looking at pro forma right now because the actual cash flow was negative because they had a negative NOI. But you can use the 50% rule, which is very similar to the 60% rule that we previously talked about, to come up with the cash flow number. So because the NOI does not include subtracting out the CapEx, the taxes, and the debt servicing, it's at 60%. But once you subtract those out, now you're down to 50%. So you'll hear a lot about the 50% rule when you're looking at these properties. The 50% rule basically means that you take all of your expenses, or all your expenses should equal 50% of the income coming in the door. So if you take the GRI and simply cut it in half, 50% of it, that's what you should see for the money after all expenses. And then you take that and then you subtract out your debt service and you get to your cash flow. So with the 50% rule, we should see a cash flow of about 314,000. Whereas the pro forma cash flow which is a little bit more accurate numbers. It's the formulas help it make it more accurate. We're coming out to 287,000. So the 50% rule is just a quick back of napkin number. Take your gross income, divide it in half, subtract out your debt service, and you can see what your cash flow is going to be. But to be more accurate, use this calculator, and then you get that more accurate number of 287,000. Any questions so far? All right, so we're going to move on now to the investor side of it. So anytime you're doing an LP, some form of a partnership, the partners that put money in, and it might be a simple JV agreement with somebody that you know, and that JV agreement, they might be a silent money partner, but they're going to want to know what the return is on this. If it's not that form of an agreement with somebody you have a relationship with, an established relationship, then it needs to be an LP partner, a limited partner, and that has to go through regulations. You have to file for that. It's more involved. There's legal repercussions if you don't do it correctly. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to have a JV partner that's a limited money partner, you need to have an established relationship with that person ahead of time. So this tells you how much they need to invest, which you'll see this matches the entry fee over here. And then you also have to determine what % share are your money partners going to get versus yourself or the general partners are they going to get. So, if you're wholesaling this, you probably won't be in a syndicated type of an arrangement. You won't be a general partner. You won't be a limited partner. You're just looking for that acquisition fee of 80K. But if you are going to be more involved in the whole process, if you're new, you probably will not be a general partner, because when you're dealing with large projects, more often than not, the general partners are people with more experience, and they very frequently have skin in the game. So you just keep that in mind. Smaller deals, you could very well be a partner in the deal. But when you're dealing with larger syndicated deals, unless you have some experience in it, you probably don't want to expect to be a general partner. You probably want to expect to have an acquisition fee out of it. Just a way of analyzing where you're going to take this deal and what you're going to do with it. So if you have experience, great, go for it. So over here, the limited partner cash flow share and limited partner appreciation share. Two different numbers. There's a lot of ways to put these deals together, but you can play with these numbers to see what sort of returns that your partners are going to get on this deal. So most people are going to expect at least 10% cash on cash. The higher, the better. So more people are typically either looking at cash on cash as their primary objective or IRR as their primary objective. And IRR means over the time frame that you owned this project, what was your total return in both cash flow and amortization, as well as debt pay down. So I don't mean amortization, sorry. Cash flow appreciation and debt pay down. Those three things add up to the entire return on the investment. We're not taking depreciation into account, but we are taking debt pay down, appreciation, and cash flow. So if you have a 28% return for this project over a 5-year period, that means that you take your total return, and it's a pretty involved formula, but I'm going to just give you a simplified version of that formula. Basically, what it means is you're making about, if you take the entire amount, including that huge paycheck you get when you sell the place, and you divide it out across the 5 years, it would be like a 28% return on your money every single year. That's a great project. So you want the cash on cash. What I like to look for is at least 10% cash on cash and at least 20% IRR. Some people want to buy and hold. They don't care about IRR. They're not planning on this being a project that they flip in 5 years. They want to hold it indefinitely. So IRR is not so important for them. Cash on cash is much more important for them. So you can play with these cash flow and appreciation share to get the right numbers for cash on cash and IRR. So typically, general partners will take about 20% of the deal. I say typically, but it really varies from project to project. It could be 20%, it could be 30%, it could be 10, 15%. But if you adjust this number, like let's say the cash flow share, if you feel that this number is a little bit weak, well, the general partners might sacrifice a little bit of their share and give more to the limited partners to take the cash on cash up. See how that works? And whatever you can do to lower the entry fee will also take that cash on cash up. So you can play with the percent. Let's say you're negotiating it and you want to make sure it's if you want this at 80% and you want a better cash on cash, you can say, well, what would it be if instead of a 7% interest rate, let's say that I got a 6.5% interest rate. Now my cash on cash went up to 11.3%. So you can play with these numbers to see what your return is going to be. And the ROI is basically if they put in $100, they have 3.2x their money over those 5 years. So if you're looking at a project that they're going to exit out of in a few years, you want to look at what's the multiplier of their money that they put into it. And I like to look at a 3x. So if they put in $100,000 5 years later or less, then they'll get 300,000 out of the deal with all of their monies combined, the cash flow, the appreciation, and the principal pay down. So that gives you the overall, these three numbers are the most important numbers for investors. The cash flow is also important, but overall cash flow doesn't really tell the whole story because it's not taking into account how much money they put into the deal. So if somebody put $1 million into the deal, $30,000 cash flow is not so good. In this case, they put $2 million into the deal. They get 300,000 out of it. What does that mean? Is that good? Is that bad? Well, it equates to 10.7%. So this cash on cash is a much more important number than the cash flow. All right, let me go to questions. What does IRR stand for? It stands for internal rate of return. Internal rate of return. It's a complicated formula, but basically it just think of it as a way of taking your entire return for that number of years and evening it out across those years as if it was a 28% for the whole time instead of 10% for, if you look down below, you can see year to year how it adjusts. So the cash on cash for year one, 10 points, or I should say year two. Year one is the rehab project year. Year two is when you actually start seeing solid numbers. So 10.7%, 11.4, 12.1, 12.8, it grows. The cash on cash grows a little bit every year because you're improving your numbers year by year for your rent. Every year you can go up a little bit in rent. You're still going up a little bit in taxes and expenses, but because the rent is a bigger number, it causes this cash on cash to increase a little bit year by year. And then that's where the cash on cash comes in. The IRR is over here. And typically you want to get out of the project to have the strongest IRR. You want to get out sooner, better than later, because your big payoff is after you fix, kind of like in a house, a fix and flip. If you do a fix and flip and you're out in 3 months, you are much better off than if you're out in 6 months. Same sort of scenario, except we're talking about years instead of months. You might get out of it in 18 months, but typically it's going to be a little longer. And part of the reason is because it has to be what they call seasoned. So as a property is being seasoned, you develop the paperwork that shows the consistency of the money flow. T12 is 12 months of that money flow, T24, T36. So being able to develop that paperwork and provide that T12 or T24 or T36, that gives the validity to how you're trying to advertise this property. So you don't necessarily want to get out immediately after you renovate it, because you don't have that seasoning, you don't have that T12, that paperwork. So once you get out a little bit later, it's been seasoned, your IRR will be a little bit lower, but that's okay, because it's really hard to sell an IRR where you only held a property for 6 months. Does that make sense? Let me see what we got in here. So the limited partner is someone who covers the entry fee completely. Well, when you say someone, it's really typically several people. It's not just one person, but multiple people. So you have the bank is going to cover your primary loan, and then you might have seller finance, but anything else beyond your funding 1 and funding 2 will be your limited partner in the case of a syndication. And it might be 100 limited partners. It might be 20 limited partners. So you'll have multiple limited partners that together will provide that entry fee. Does that answer your question, Sharon? All right, next question. Can you send us your contact info just in case we have questions? Yeah, I'm going to put here my email and my phone number. Okay, so yeah, feel free to contact me. Actively looking for good deals and happy to help out. Okay, at what point does an investment like this become a REIA? So Jim, I am not an expert on REITs. I would love to answer that question, but I cannot do that in good, I don't have the knowledge at this point to answer that question well. Sorry, Jim, but I'll do a little research and try to get back to you on that, okay? What is your buy box? Yeah, no problem. So what I'm looking for deals similar to what you see here. I prefer it to be positive cash flowing out of the gate. This project itself was a really good deal, but it has a much higher entry fee because of the rehab cost. I'm not really looking for this in particular. However, I am looking to wholesale deals like this. So if you find a deal like this that you can wholesale, I'm happy to work with you on it, help you to get the numbers you need, help you to negotiate, help you to find buyers. We can work together on that. What I'm looking for at my stage for my holding is much smaller properties. 116, I don't have unless it's if this was a very solid cash flow and a seller finance, I would be in on it. If it's a bank, I would not be in on it. I need to have something with a much lower down payment, lower percent, so the entrance fee is taken way down. So let's say, for example, in this case, I do seller finance, and instead of the rehab costs being 1.4 million, I'll just make it 100,000. Now you see the entry fee dropped significantly, right? So I would be more interested in that sort of a deal personally, but I'm happy to help with a wholesale situation on any sort of a deal. And in the case of the one that's cash flowing out of the gate. Like if I take this 71% and I change it to 85%, now it's a positive cash flow situation. I would prefer personally positive cash flow out of the gate, and then we do the initial upgrade exterior, so it gives it curb appeal and the appearance of upgrading the asset class. And then as the vacancies are there, we upgrade each of those vacancies and improve the rents on them. So we never end up with a negative cash flow situation. It's always positive cash flowing. And when you're done with the property and you exit, you end up with a nice paycheck at the end, so that you have month by month, you're making money, and you're also making money on the exit when you basically force the appreciation by improving the NOI and by decreasing the cash flow. Property size, my preference is to be at least 20 units. If you get smaller than 20, it's just harder to, everything you have is going to take a little bit of time and effort, and the time and effort involved with a small place becomes more significant. I should say you don't get the money out of it for what you're looking for. So will I do a 10 unit? If it makes sense. The numbers have to be strong to really make sense on something small like that. 20 to me is better, but again, if you're going to wholesale a 10 unit, that might make sense. Or if you get a smoking deal on a 10, then I would be interested in that. I'm looking personally for North Carolina to get into a multifamily. I'm not looking for anything outside of North Carolina, because when you're buying a property, you want to walk every unit and you want to make sure that the condition of every unit. So that's why North Carolina. Atlanta's close enough I could do it, but it's got to be in a proximity to feel comfortable to take it on. But when you're wholesaling, it's another story. You don't have to. I would be happy to help in wholesaling a good property that someone comes across. The buy box is much, much wider on that. And we can just go through and I can tell you if it's a good deal or not a good deal, or how to make it a good deal. All right, so would the negative NOI drop the value of the property? Vila, I don't know if you can unmute for a minute. When you're talking about negative NOI, I think you're talking about what we see right here. Is that correct? Oh, your mic is broken. So you're talking about this number right here, B13. If you're talking about a different one, just tell me the letter number, like B13 or what you're talking about. Okay, yeah. So that most definitely lowers the value of it for certain. But you also have to look at the potential and why it's money flowing negative. So your offer, the purchase price right here that you're going to make on this property, it might be close to the 60% rule, like I'm showing right here at 4.6, or it might be significantly lower. In this case, 4 million is a fair amount lower. It takes into account that it's mismanaged. It's not where it needs to be. But it also needs to take into account why the numbers are this low. In this property in particular, that it's negative cash flowing because it was government subsidized rents. And then it came out of that program. And when it came out of that program, the government stopped paying them a part of the portion of the bill. So all of a sudden it became negative. And that's why the property was not performing well, is because all the rents were subsidized and now it has to be flipped over to a non-subsidized rent arrangement. So those are the sort of things you have to take into account. If it does require some rehab, but the rehab that it requires does not make it unlivable. But the challenge here is that when you're flipping the rents over, you basically have to turn over all of the tenants to tenants that are not government subsidized tenants. So that means you're going to have a lot of time where it's empty while you're doing that process and while you're flipping it. So in this case, it makes more sense to do the rehab up front because of the fact that you're going to have to flip your tenants anyway. Whereas in another property, you could take this and just do your apartments one by one as they become vacant, so you maintain a positive cash flow. You got to look at all of those things to try to determine what a good purchase price is and an appropriate evaluation of it as it stands right now. So 60% rule said 4.6 million. I plugged in 4 million based off of these ideas of, you know, the fact that it's coming out of a government subsidized situation, it's mismanaged, and it's a lot of upfront costs for rehab. Okay, so let me see what else we got here. I wasn't here when you explained this. What is EGI? EGI is effective gross income. So the effective gross income takes your GRI, your gross rent income, times your occupancy rate, and adds in any other income you have in the property, such as laundry and vending machines and things like that. What about South Carolina? Yeah, Brandon, I could do South Carolina if it makes sense. I could definitely help with wholesaling in South Carolina, but I could also do South Carolina holding if it makes sense. All right, we're 23 minutes overtime. I'm happy to help out if any other questions you have. I'm happy to answer them at the moment. So y'all got my number and name and email address. So let me put it in again. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email if you would like to go in together on a deal. You want me to help you evaluate a property or have a question, happy to help. All right, so we have here another thing. Does this calculator have an option where you do subject to on a part of the deal and seller finance the other portions? No, it does not. That could be done with a lot of times with multifamily. There's a lot of balloons out there, so it's a little bit more challenging with multifamily to do that sort of hybrid subject to seller finance, but it most definitely could be done. The calculator doesn't show that at this point in time. It's something that I can probably add in over time, but no, it currently does not have that. So I would just try to, if you're going to have that scenario, try to tweak these numbers. So like, let's say that your bank finance, your subject to is 5% and your seller finance is 7%, and the seller finance is, you know, let's say it's 50-50, then you just make this interest rate 6%. You know, over time, I might be able to improve it like that. But the reality is there's not going to be too many deals in the multifamily space, commercial multifamily, where you're doing subject to and seller finance. All right, any other questions before we cut out? I appreciate all of you, appreciate you being here with me. And you're welcome, everybody, Carrie and everyone else. Have a great evening and hear from you soon. You bet, bye-bye.